The Eastern Front, summer of 1942. Night has fallen over the scorched fields of the Don and the twisting river valleys leading towards Stalingrad. German infantrymen, exhausted from endless marching and constant Soviet counterattacks, settle into their trenches to rest. The sky is moonless, the air completely still. Only the distant rumble of artillery reminds them that the war never truly sleeps. Then something changes. A faint sound begins drifting down from above. Not the roar of an engine, not the scream of a dive bomber, a soft, eerie rustle, almost like wind pushing through dry branches. A whisper, a sigh, a shiver of air. Soldiers look up, trying to see the source. There is nothing, only blackness. Then without warning, boom! A sudden explosion tears through an ammunition dump. Behind the lines, flames leap into the night as debris rains across the ground. The men scramble for cover, shouting commands into the darkness. Again the whispering returns. Again the explosions follow. Some soldiers swear that what they heard was the sound of witches flying overhead on broomsticks. Others insist it was ghosts. Many simply freeze, terrified, unable to understand how a Soviet aircraft could approach so silently and so precisely. They can hear the bombs, they can see the fires, but the attacker remains invisible. Only later do German officers learn the truth. The Soviets have deployed an all-female night bombing regiment. Young women flying ancient, slow, canvas-covered biplanes, wooden frames built long before the war, meant for crop dusting and flight schools. Aircraft so primitive and underpowered that German radar barely notices them. Machines that glide like shadows through the night. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment. To the women who flew them, these planes were Po-2s. To the Germans who heard their strange, ghostly whisper just seconds before the explosions, they were something far more terrifying, Nachthexen, the Night Witches. This is the story of how fragile, open-cockpit biplanes, handled by teenage girls and young women, became one of the most feared bombing units of the Second World War. Story of ingenuity, bravery, desperation, and terror in the darkest hours of the Eastern Front. Tonight, the German army learns the first lesson. You cannot fight what you cannot hear until it's already too late. When the German invasion crashed into the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Red Army was overwhelmed on every front. Factories fell silent, airfields burned, and the Soviet Air Force, already outdated, lost nearly 4,000 aircraft in the first 3 days. In desperation, the Soviet High Command began seeking unconventional solutions. One of the most surprising came from a woman who refused to be ignored. Her name was Marina Raskova, often called the Soviet Amelia Earhart. A record-breaking aviator, navigator, and national hero, she had survived a daring 1938 flight in which she crash-landed in remote Siberia after navigating thousands of kilometers through storms and darkness. Her reputation gave her rare influence in Stalin's government, and with the war growing increasingly desperate, she chose to use it. Raskova petitioned Stalin directly to form all-female aviation regiments, not propaganda units, not auxiliaries, but fully combat-capable squadrons. Stalin agreed. On October 8, 1941, he signed Order Number 0099, creating 3 female units, including the 588 Night Bomber Regiment. The regiment's recruits were astonishingly young. Many were teenagers who had just completed high school. Others were university students who left their studies to volunteer. Most had never fired a weapon and had flown only basic training aircraft, but they were united by a fierce desire for revenge, patriotism, and survival. Their families had been killed. Their cities burned. The enemy was advancing. Upon arrival at the Engels Military Aviation School on the Volga River, the women found themselves confronted with harsh military discipline and limited resources. They received oversized men's uniforms, boots stuffed with rags, and parachutes designed for male pilots twice their weight. Their hair was cut short, their training was accelerated from 2 years to mere months. Worst of all, the aircraft assigned to them were an insult by military standards. The Polikarpov Po, 2A slow, flimsy, fabric-covered biplane, powered by a small 125 horsepower engine. Its maximum speed was so low that German fighters often stalled trying to intercept it. It carried no armor, no radio, and no advanced navigation equipment. Its open cockpit meant the pilots froze in winter and were drenched in summer storms. But in the hands of Raskova's trainees, the Po-2 would become something entirely unexpected, a perfect night bomber. The aircraft's light wooden frame made it nearly invisible to German radar. It produced only a gentle whooshing sound during low-speed glides, exactly the ghostly whisper that terrified German troops. Its tiny engine allowed the plane to fly slow and low, navigating by rivers, roads, and moonlight. The women trained relentlessly, steep turns, low-level flying, emergency landings, bombing practice in darkness. Their instructors were astonished by how quickly they adapted exhausted, freezing, barely fed. The young aviators learned to fly their fragile machines with instinctive grace. By spring 1942, the 588 Night Bomber Regiment was ready for combat. The Germans had no idea that soon, in the darkness above the front line, a new kind of enemy was coming, one made not of steel and engines, but of canvas, courage, and determination. When the women of the 588th Regiment arrived at their first frontline airfield, they were finally introduced to the aircraft that would carry them into combat. Many had imagined sleek Yak fighters or sturdy Il-2 attack planes. Instead, they were met with something that looked as if it belonged in a museum. The Polikarpov Po-2 was a relic, designed in 1928, built of wood and canvas, with an engine small enough to resemble that of a tractor rather than a warplane. It was originally used for crop dusting, mail delivery, and training new pilots. Its maximum speed barely reached 150 kilometers per hour. Its cockpit was open to the cold, the wind, and enemy fire. The women joked bitterly, "The only thing modern about the Po-2 is that it burns just as fast." And yet, hidden beneath its fragile frame were qualities that made it perfect for the Night Witch's method of attack. The Po-2's small Shvetsov engine was incredibly quiet at low throttle. When the pilots cut power during their bombing run, the plane would glide silently through the darkness, making only the faint whispering sound that terrified German soldiers. The aircraft's low stall speed allowed it to maneuver through trees, valleys, and riverbeds where faster aircraft would crash. Its wooden structure reflected almost no radar signature, making it nearly impossible for German early warning systems to detect. But these advantages came at a heavy cost. The open cockpit exposed the women to the worst conditions the Eastern Front could offer. Winter flights meant temperatures of minus 30 degrees Celsius, with frost forming on goggles and eyebrows. Pilots returned with numb hands, faces burned by freezing wind, and uniforms stiff with ice. In summer, the same cockpit filled with insects, smoke, and dust that choked their lungs and made breathing difficult. The Po-2 carried only 2 bombs, each weighing between 50 and 100 kilograms, mounted beneath the wings. To deliver them, the navigator leaned out of the cockpit, physically dropping the bombs by hand. There were no electronic sights, no radios, and no armor. A single tracer round could ignite the fuel tank. A burst from a machine gun could tear the canvas wings apart. Yet despite all this, the women formed an emotional bond with their strange little aircraft. They decorated them with flowers, gave them affectionate nicknames, and learned every sound of the engine. The Po-2 was slow, vulnerable, and outdated, but it was theirs. The German soldiers who heard the whispering approach of these ancient biplanes believed they were facing a supernatural force. They couldn't understand how such fragile machines could keep coming night after night, flying through storms, through flak, through tracer fire, always returning, always striking again. The secret was simple: skill, courage, and a plane that no one, not even its designers, had ever imagined would become a weapon of psychological terror. As winter 1942 hardened across the Southern Front, the women of the 588 Regiment found themselves pushed into one of the most intense and unforgiving training programs of the entire Soviet Air Force. Their mission was night bombing. Their battlefield was the darkness itself. Every evening, as the sun dropped behind the steppe, the regiment's airfield transformed from a sleepy outpost into a hive of activity. Mechanics hauled out the Po-2s, checking the wooden ribs and canvas skins for tiers. Navigators spread maps across makeshift tables, marking German supply roads, headquarters, fuel dumps, and artillery positions. Pilots tied scarves around their necks and slipped into cockpits that would soon freeze solid. The training was brutal not because of the aircraft, though the Po-2 was unforgiving, but because of the techniques the women were expected to master. A typical night's lessons included: 1. Ultra-low altitude flying. The Po-2 skimmed the ground at treetop height. One wrong move and the plane would tangle in branches or plow into an unseen ridge. 2. Silent gliding attacks. At a signal from the navigator, the pilot cut the engine. The world fell silent. The aircraft glided like a falling leaf. The women were taught to aim their descent using only moonlight, instinct, and a sense of air pressure on their faces. 3. Multi-sortie operations. Unlike standard bomber units, the Night Witches flew 8 to 15 missions per night. After each bombing run, they landed, rearmed, refueled, and were airborne again within minutes. 4. Emergency crash procedures. With no radio, no lights, and no armor, malfunction often meant death. The women practiced forced landings in darkness, rehearsing by feel which way the wind blew and whether the ground below was mud, snow, or forest. 5. Navigating without instruments. Their maps were often hand-drawn. Their only guides were rivers, railroad tracks, bonfires, and sometimes the glow of burning villages. The instructors, hardened male veterans, arrived skeptical, but the women quickly silenced every doubt. They learned fast. They adapted faster. They flew with precision, handling the Po-2's quirks as though they were extensions of their own bodies. What none of them were trained for was the emotional toll. The women formed deep bonds. They wrote letters home. They slept in barns, dugouts, and half-collapsed huts. They shared one another's fears and grief. When someone failed to return from a training flight, the absence cut sharper than any winter wind. But every loss strengthened their resolve. As their training progressed, They knew the moment was coming. Soon they would fly into the black sky not as students, but as combat aviators. Soon they would face German searchlights, flak, night fighters, and the terrifying uncertainty of flying through darkness with nothing but a wooden frame between them and death. And when the call finally came to deploy to the front, they were ready, not because their planes were strong, but because they were. In the summer of 1942, as the German army pushed deep into the Caucasus toward the oil fields of Grozny and Baku, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment received its first combat assignment. Their mission was simple in theory, terrifying in practice. Disrupt German supply lines, slow their advance, bomb them every night. The regiment relocated to a rough frontline airfield, a narrow strip of dirt surrounded by orchards and low hills. The women pitched tents, unpacked their wooden potus, and prepared for their very first operational flights. The mood was tense. Some of the pilots were 19, one was 17. None had seen real combat. As dusk faded, mechanics loaded the potus bomb racks, two 50-kilogram bombs under the wings. The navigators double-checked their hand-drawn maps, tracing German positions near the Terek River. The pilots tightened their scarves and adjusted their goggles. At 2200 hours, the order came. 588th Regiment, airborne. The first pair of Po-2s lifted slowly from the dirt runway, engines buzzing like oversized insects. They climbed into a dark sky with no horizon, no stars, only blackness. The ground below dissolved. The war began. For the pilots, the first minutes were the most frightening. They had practiced night flying, but this was different. This was the front. Searchlights, anti-aircraft guns, German night fighters. And unlike the Germans, the night witches had no radios to warn each other of danger. As they approached the target, a German supply depot hidden in a cluster of trees, the navigator leaned out of the cockpit with a flashlight covered by her glove. She signaled, "Cut engine." The pilot pulled the throttle to idle. Instant silence. The Po-2 glided, weightless, rocking gently in the wind. The women listened to the whisper of the canvas wings, the soft rush of air, the distant murmur of trucks below. Then the navigator tugged her sleeve. Now. 2 bombs fell. Seconds later, the night exploded with orange fire. Flames swallowed the supply dump. German soldiers shouted commands. Machine guns opened up wildly, spraying the sky in panic. Searchlights crisscrossed the darkness, but the Po-2 was already gone. Low, slow, and silent. The first mission had lasted 13 minutes, but for the women, it felt like 13 years. By dawn, the regiment had completed over 50 sorties. Their hands were frozen, their faces blackened with smoke, their nerves frayed. But they had done what no one expected. They succeeded. Their bombs destroyed ammunition stores, fuel tanks, and motorized columns desperately needed by the Germans advancing into the Caucasus. Even more importantly, the psychological effect was immediate. German reports describe small, slow aircraft that bomb us continuously, noting that the attacks kept entire divisions awake throughout the night. It was only their first night of combat. There would be thousands more. The night witches had arrived. By late 1942, German troops along the Terek and Don rivers had learned to fear the whispering approach of the night witches. But what made these young women, flying slow wooden biplanes, so deadly against one of the most advanced air forces in the world? The answer lay not in technology, but in tactics. Unlike conventional bomber units, which flew in tight formations, The night witches operated in small groups of 2 or 3 planes. Each crew carried only 2 bombs, but they compensated with precision, coordination, and creativity. Their most famous tactic became known as the carousel. 2 Po-2s approached a German position from opposite directions. One descended to low altitude and cut its engine, gliding silently. The second stayed higher, keeping its engine running and flying a noisy, erratic pattern. The Germans typically aimed their searchlights and anti-aircraft fire at the louder aircraft, never realizing the real bomber was already overhead in complete silence. As the first woman dropped her bombs and escaped into the night, the second plane descended to glide bomb from a new angle. A third aircraft often joined the attack, alternating altitude and timing, creating the illusion of a far larger force. The Germans were forced awake all night, their nerves shattered by the constant cycle of explosions and eerie silence. In some sectors, reports claimed the night witches attacked every 15 minutes. It wasn't true, but the fear made it believable. The women also used their environment as a weapon. They approached along rivers to avoid detection, hid behind ridges, and flew low enough that treetops brushed their landing gear. When German radar stations were introduced, the Po-2's wooden frame made it nearly invisible. Only the sound of the engine, barely audible at night, could betray them. When threatened by German night fighters, the women relied on the one advantage their plane had. It was too slow to shoot down. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters stalled at low speeds, making them almost useless against the Po-2. German ace Johannes Steinhoff once complained, "The Po-2 was so slow, it was impossible to shoot down. You approached, and suddenly you were falling out of the sky." The night witches turned their apparent weaknesses into strengths. Their lack of speed became survivability. Their fragile aircraft made them stealthy. Their small bombs forced them to become accurate. Their low-altitude flying made them unpredictable. And their courage, more than any technological advantage, gave them dominance over the battlefield. By exploiting psychology, manipulating darkness, and using unpredictable timing, the night witches didn't just bomb the Germans, they exhausted them, frightened them, and stole their sleep. Every night, the whisper returned. Every night, the Germans braced for another attack. The night witches had mastered the sky by mastering fear. Life for the night witches was a constant balance between duty and survival. Their missions were dangerous enough, but the hours between them were often just as brutal. Their frontline bases were nothing like comfortable Soviet rear area installations. Most nights, the women slept in dirt dugouts, barns, abandoned farmhouses, or collapsed sheds that barely kept out wind and rain. Food was scarce. Water was cold. Uniforms froze stiff overnight. Insects swarmed in the summer. Rats crept over their blankets in winter. Yet the women endured it all with humor and stubborn pride. They decorated their Po-2s with flowers and chalk drawings. They sang songs, told jokes, and wrote letters to families they might never see again. But their greatest hardship was loss. Unlike many male squadrons, the women lived, trained, and fought together every hour of every day. They were sisters in the truest sense. So when one plane didn't return from a night mission, the absence cut deep, far deeper than military manuals ever prepared them for. Sometimes a Po-2 vanished without warning, swallowed by the dark. Other times, it crash-landed in enemy territory, and the women could only hope their friends were taken prisoner instead of killed. The regiment had no illusions. German troops were not known for mercy toward captured Soviet pilots, especially women. One of the most devastating losses came when Yevdokia Nosal, one of the regiment's finest navigators, was killed by German anti-aircraft fire. A single burst tore through the cockpit. Her pilot, though wounded, managed to land the Po-2 and save the aircraft. But Nosal's death shook the regiment to its core. She became one of the first women aircrew in the war to receive the Hero of the Soviet Union medal, posthumously. Despite their grief, the Night Witches had no time for mourning. Every night brought new missions. Every dawn brought empty beds. They honored the dead the only way they knew how, by flying again. Life on the airfield was a constant race against exhaustion. The women often flew 10 to 15 sorties per night, returning in near darkness to rearm and refuel by hand. Mechanics, many of them women too, worked with frozen fingers, patching holes in wings and replacing damaged parts by lantern light. After landing from a mission, a pilot might have only 10 minutes before taking off again. Sleep became a luxury, fear became routine, courage became habit. Yet through it all, the Night Witches found strength in one another. They shared one coat when the temperature dropped below freezing. They passed around a single pair of warm boots. They laughed despite everything, leaning on each other for support. In the worst nights, when searchlights pierced the sky and flak roared like thunderstorms, the women looked around the cramped dugout, saw familiar faces illuminated by candlelight, and reminded themselves why they fought. For each other, for their fallen sisters, for the chance to greet one more dawn. This unbreakable bond would carry them through some of the most dangerous missions of the entire war. The Night Witches did not win their reputation through numbers or firepower. They won it through ingenuity. Their fragile Po-2 biplanes were completely outmatched by every German fighter in the sky. Yet night after night, they struck targets deep behind enemy lines, slipping through searchlights and anti-aircraft guns, using tactics so unconventional that even German commanders struggled to counter them. Their most iconic method was a legendary cut-engine glide. As the Po-2 approached a target, the pilot pulled the throttle back to idle. The tiny radial engine sputtered, then fell silent. Suddenly, the aircraft became nearly invisible. No engine noise, no exhaust flames, just the whisper of wind over wings. To the German soldiers on the ground, the aircraft seemed to materialize out of thin air. The enemy began calling them Nachthexen, night witches, because the faint whooshing of their wooden wings reminded them of broomsticks slicing through the night. But the glide attack was only one weapon in their tactical arsenal. Because the Po-2 was so slow, barely 100 kilometers per hour at combat weight, it could turn inside German fighters with ease. Enemy aircraft often overshot their targets, unable to match the biplane's tight turning radius. Some German pilots refused to chase them at low altitude, fearing they would stall before the Po-2 did. The slow, outdated biplane had unexpectedly become a maneuverability specialist. Another tactic relied on decoys and distraction. Each bombing group of 3 aircraft divided roles. Plane 1 attracted searchlights and flak by flying toward the target at higher altitude. Plane 2 followed close behind to force German gunners to split their fire. Plane 3 dove silently with engine cut, dropping bombs before the enemy realized an attack was underway. This triangular formation maximized confusion and survival. They also flew at treetop level, using dark forests and rolling terrain to hide from radar. Their biplanes' wood and canvas construction made them nearly invisible to German detection systems that were calibrated for metal aircraft. This low-tech advantage frustrated even the most advanced Luftwaffe radar crews. Navigation was another challenge. The women flew without modern instruments, relying on star patterns, hand-drawn maps, the glow of rivers under moonlight, the silhouette of enemy searchlight beams. A mistake of even a few degrees could send them miles off course, or straight into German positions. Yet their night navigation skills became so refined that pilots could find isolated bunkers or supply depots in total darkness, dropping bombs with startling accuracy. Weather often became an unexpected weapon. Fog, snow, and cloud cover allowed the Po-2s to slip through defenses unseen. But these same conditions turned every mission into a gamble. Icing on the wings, sudden wind gusts, or hidden tree lines could kill a pilot long before the Germans fired a shot. Still, the Night Witches embraced danger. Their survival depended on constant improvisation, changing altitude, killing the engine, timing their approach to avoid predictable patterns. They mastered the art of disappearing into darkness and reappearing exactly where the enemy least expected. By 1943, German troops dreaded nights when the sky was clear and their campfires glowed. They knew that somewhere above, drifting silently through the clouds, the Night Witches were already coming. By 1943 and 1944, the Night Witches were no longer an experimental novelty. They had become one of the Soviet Union's most reliable precision strike units. Their missions hit ammunition depots, frontline trenches, river crossings, command posts, rail hubs, and supply lines with clockwork consistency. But several major operations would define their legend and prove just how decisive their tiny biplanes could be. One of the first turning points came at Novorossiysk. German troops had fortified the port city into a near-impenetrable stronghold. Every Soviet assault had stalled, but night after night, the 588th Regiment harassed German supply points and artillery batteries. Their Po-2s dropped small bombs, often just 2 to 4 at a time. But the constant disruption shattered German sleep, morale, and logistics. By the time Soviet ground forces launched their final assault, the defenders were exhausted. Officers later admitted the Night Witches made consolidated rest impossible. The capture of Novorossiysk opened the path toward Crimea and elevated the regiment's reputation throughout the Red Army. Another defining moment came during the battles for Smolensk. Here the women faced some of the most dangerous anti-aircraft concentrations on the Eastern Front. German searchlights crisscrossed the sky, forming lethal cages of white light. The Po-2s appeared helpless against the dense flak, but their unpredictable flight patterns and silent descents allowed them to slip through defenses. The regiment destroyed multiple ammunition dumps and disrupted German troop movements for weeks. Their work was so effective that several German units reported constant nocturnal harassment and begged for reinforcements just to get rest. But the Night Witches' greatest turning point came during the massive Soviet push into Belarusia, known as Operation Bagration. Here the regiment flew one of its highest sortie counts of the war, conducting up to 18 missions per night. Their primary targets were enemy supply lines and retreat routes, bridges, crossroads, and columns trying to escape encirclement. During these operations, the Po-2's slow speed became a surprising tactical asset. Flying low over forested terrain, they were able to spot German units hidden under camouflage nets or tree cover. Targets faster aircraft sped past without ever noticing. In one 48-hour period, the regiment dropped enough explosives to halt a German withdrawal column long enough for Soviet ground forces to overrun it. This contribution, though rarely highlighted in Western histories, was crucial to the rapid Soviet advance. These turning point battles reshaped how Soviet commanders used the regiment. What began as a night harassment unit evolved into a strategic tool capable of influencing frontline dynamics. The Night Witches did not merely fly missions, they shaped outcomes. Their success also changed German behavior. Soldiers began reporting increased anxiety at sundown. Command posts ordered strict blackout protocols. Anti-aircraft crews doubled their night shifts. Even small bonfires in trenches were banned, as pilots often used the glow to locate targets. The Night Witches had become an atmospheric weapon, a psychological presence that hovered over the German front like a phantom. They wore down enemy willpower one sleepless night at a time. By 1944, the regiment was no longer a symbol of women's contribution to the war. It was a battlefield asset feared enough to influence entire operational plans. When the war finally entered its closing months in 1945, the Night Witches were no longer an obscure formation flying outdated aircraft. They had become one of the most decorated regiments in the entire Soviet Air Force, and unquestionably the most famous all-female combat flying unit in history. By the end of the war, the women of the 588th, later redesignated as the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment, had flown over 24,000 combat sorties. They dropped thousands of tons of bombs, disrupted German logistics across multiple fronts, and earned the respect of Soviet ground forces and foreign observers alike. Their contribution was impossible to ignore. In several offensives, including the Crimean Liberation and Operation Bagration, their nighttime harassment missions softened enemy positions so effectively that Soviet troops advanced faster than expected. Yet victory came at a cost. Dozens of Night Witches were killed, some shot down, some lost in storms, others disappearing forever into the dark forests of the Eastern Front. Their wooden biplanes, barely upgraded since the 1920s, offered no armor and no mercy. Every pilot knew that if her Po-2 was hit, she had almost no protection, but those who survived lived to see their regiment honored with the elite title Guards, a mark of exceptional bravery. 23 women were named Heroes of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor available. Many others earned Orders of the Red Banner, the Patriotic War, and medals for courage under fire. After the war's end, however, recognition quickly faded. When peace returned, the Soviet Union demobilized its female combat units. Many Night Witches found themselves pushed aside, told to return to traditional women's roles. Some became teachers, engineers, factory workers, or clerks. Others attempted to continue flying, but male pilots were given priority in civilian aviation. For years, their wartime achievements were mentioned only in scattered memoirs and short newspaper articles. Their Po-2 aircraft were scrapped or abandoned. Their uniforms disappeared. Only their memories remained, and yet the legend refused to die. In the decades that followed, historians and veterans began to rediscover the story of the Night Witches. What had once been treated as a wartime curiosity became recognized as a groundbreaking chapter in aviation history. Their unique blend of courage, tactical innovation, and sheer determination captured global imagination. The women themselves were humble about their accomplishments. They insisted they were not heroes, simply soldiers doing their duty. but their legacy speaks for them. Today, the night witches are remembered not only as aviators, but as pioneers who broke barriers that had stood for centuries. They proved women could fly combat missions, command aircraft, drop bombs under fire, and change the outcome of major battles. More than that, they proved that heroism knows no gender. As memorials rose in Russia, Belarus, and Georgia, and as museums restored surviving Poe, two biplanes for display, the Night Witches finally took their place in global history. Their stories now told in documentaries, books, classrooms, and air museums across the world. The Poe 2 was slow, simple, and fragile. The women who flew it were not, they were unstoppable. Their engines may have gone silent, but their legacy will echo for generations.